The moment started like any ordinary evening, until the HOA cop came storming into my driveway, eyes wild, hand on his gun. My heart froze as he demanded I move my car, citing some absurd $79 fine that didn't even make sense. But what he didn't know was who he was threatening. My daughter stepped forward, calm, unshakable, and suddenly the power shifted. This wasn't going to be an ordinary confrontation. Little did he realize he had just walked into a storm he couldn't handle. How far would he go before realizing he'd underestimated us completely? Life in our quiet suburban neighborhood always felt safe, predictable, and almost boring. Tree-lined streets, freshly mowed lawns, and neighbors who waved as they passed. It was the kind of place people brag about when they move in. My daughter, a dedicated and disciplined woman, balanced her intense career with a love for running along the winding sidewalks, greeting everyone she passed with a confident nod. I had settled into my home with a sense of calm, thinking the hardest part of life here would be choosing which flower bed to plant this spring. But beneath the manicured lawns and smiling faces, a subtle tension always lingered. The HOA committee, self-appointed enforcers of every rule, seemed to watch everything. How we parked, how our trash bins lined up, even how loud our laughter carried on weekends. At first, it was just the occasional note on the door or a minor fine for some arbitrary rule. I brushed it off, thinking these were petty inconveniences, easy to ignore in a community I loved. Little did I know, those small infractions were just the opening moves in a game that could spiral into something dangerous. A $79 violation, a neighbor's complaint about a car, and suddenly, the ordinary had started to feel like a trap. The calm, predictable life we had cherished was about to collide with the absurd authority of an HOA member who believed he had more power than he actually did. And when that collision came, it would put everything and everyone we cared about in the crosshairs. From the first day the HOA complaint landed on our doorstep, life in the neighborhood started to feel like walking a tightrope. At first, it was small things. My daughter's car was allegedly improperly parked, even though it was perfectly aligned with the driveway. A note left on the windshield warned of a $79 fine if the situation wasn't corrected immediately. I thought it was a one-time mistake, a bureaucratic hiccup, but the pattern became clear within weeks. Rules that seemed straightforward on paper were applied inconsistently. Neighbors across the street could leave their garbage cans out for days without consequence, while our front lawn was scrutinized for the height of the grass blades. The HOA, with its self-appointed enforcers, seemed to enjoy wielding authority over trivial details. Every interaction felt like walking into a trap designed to provoke frustration. We tried to comply, of course. Letters were written, forms filled out, and explanations politely offered. Yet each attempt to appease them seemed to provoke more scrutiny. One afternoon, a neighbor called to complain about the suspicious noise from our backyard workout sessions. My daughter, who maintained a rigorous fitness routine as a Navy SEAL trainer, was doing nothing more than strength training in the yard. Still, a formal notice arrived. Noise violation, repeated offenses could escalate to fines. Each letter from the HOA felt like a dagger. The petty rules multiplied. Colors of house trim, placement of welcome mats, even how late the Christmas lights stayed up. My daughter, normally calm and collected, began noticing the absurdity creeping into every corner of our life. The tension built with every knock on the door and every terse email from the HOA board. Then came the parking incident. Our driveway, wide enough for 2 vehicles, became a battlefield. An HOA-appointed security officer, a man with more attitude than authority, decided it was his personal mission to monitor our comings and goings. One afternoon, as my daughter returned home from a late training session, he blocked the entrance to our driveway. She politely asked him to move. He refused, citing some obscure regulation about parking too close to the curb. The situation escalated faster than anyone could have predicted. Voices were raised. My daughter remained composed, calmly explaining the facts. But the officer's hand was on his holstered weapon, eyes scanning for an excuse to assert dominance. Time seemed to slow in that instant. What should have been a simple misunderstanding had the potential to spiral into violence. That was the moment I realized the petty disputes were no longer just inconvenient, they were dangerous. The stakes had shifted. My daughter, who could handle herself in high-stakes military operations, was facing a neighborhood enforcer who didn't understand the consequences of his actions. Every warning letter, every complaint, every arbitrary fine had led to this single boiling point. And just when we thought it couldn't get worse, the officer made a move that crossed the line from petty tyranny to outright intimidation. He brandished his weapon, a gesture meant to scare, to assert power over a family he had no real authority over. But he had underestimated us, underestimated her. My daughter didn't flinch. She assessed the situation with a calm precision only years of training could provide. The tension in the air was palpable, a charged silence broken only by the officer's heavy breathing and the distant hum of suburban life that continued oblivious to the drama unfolding. Our neighbors peeked from behind curtains, curious but hesitant, as if they sensed a storm was brewing but didn't know its magnitude. That moment, seconds stretched into eternity, was the tipping point. Every petty rule, every absurd fine, every confrontation and complaint had built to this confrontation. And while the HOA officer thought he held the power, it was clear who truly controlled the outcome. But the question lingered, unanswered. Would he back down, recognize the danger of his actions, or would he push further, testing the limits of our patience and resolve? Every heartbeat seemed louder than the last, every glance and gesture loaded with unspoken tension. It was no longer a fight over rules. It was a fight over respect, authority, and the fundamental lesson that underestimating someone could be the gravest mistake of your life. The stage was set. The HOA's petty empire of control had finally collided with reality, and there was no turning back. What happened next would change the neighborhood forever, leaving lessons, scars, and vindication in its wake. The tension that had been building for weeks erupted in a single electric moment. The HOA officer, confident, arrogant, and dangerously misinformed, stood in our driveway, blocking any chance of my daughter leaving. His hand rested on his gun, a chilling reminder that what had started as petty rules and absurd fines had escalated into something far more dangerous. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, powerless for just a second before the clarity hit. This was no longer about a $79 fine. This was about asserting dominance, about intimidation, and he had chosen the wrong family to challenge. My daughter stepped forward, the calm precision of her stance belying the storm behind her eyes. Years of Navy SEAL training had honed her awareness, reflexes, and presence of mind, and in that moment, the difference between fear and control was absolute. The officer sneered, clearly expecting panic, hesitation, or compliance, but he found none. Instead, she held him in a gaze that was both measured and unyielding, a silent declaration that he had underestimated her. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, her voice steady, controlled, each word deliberate. "You think you have authority here, but this is private property. And you've crossed the line." There was no anger in her tone, only the quiet inevitability of someone who knew exactly what the next move should be. Every ounce of training, every experience, every high-pressure situation she had endured converged into this precise moment. The officer shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the power dynamic had flipped. But the situation was far from resolved. Behind him, the neighborhood had begun to gather discreetly, curious eyes peeking from windows, cautious onlookers watching from across the street. His performance of authority now felt absurd, exposed under the scrutiny of everyone he had hoped to intimidate. And still, he refused to back down, perhaps blinded by pride, perhaps unwilling to admit that his petty enforcement had led to something beyond his control. In that heartbeat of hesitation, my daughter executed a series of actions that were calculated, confident, and precise. She signaled me to call the police, not as a threat, but as a formal assertion of legal authority. She kept her posture relaxed but commanding, every movement radiating certainty. And then, in the quiet but potent moment, she removed her jacket to reveal a subtle insignia, a marker of her military and training credentials. The implication was immediate, unspoken. The person standing in front of him was not just capable, but trained to handle far more dangerous threats than he could imagine. The officer's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of doubt breaking the mask of bravado. He had expected confrontation, perhaps irritation, maybe even compliance, but what he faced was controlled intensity. Words faltered on his lips. Authority, which had always been his shield, suddenly became a liability. The realization was subtle at first, but unmistakable. He had misjudged the situation entirely. Then came the decisive moment. My daughter stepped forward, closing the distance with deliberate calm. In a controlled, almost casual tone, she outlined the legal implications of his actions. Blocking private property, threatening a resident, brandishing a weapon without cause. Each point was precise, unarguable, and backed by a deep understanding of both local laws and military-grade situational awareness. The officer tried to interject, to assert dominance with sharp words, but every attempt faltered under the weight of evidence and authority he could not contest. The onlookers, neighbors who had been quietly watching the escalation, began murmuring among themselves. The absurdity of his arrogance, the obvious imbalance of power, and the sheer audacity of the threats became... After the confrontation, the neighborhood seemed to breathe again, a subtle exhale of relief after weeks of tension. The officer, once an imposing figure in his self-appointed role, became a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors. His authority dismantled not through argument, but through calm, unwavering competence. The petty fines, the arbitrary rules, the notes slipped under doors. All of it had been rendered meaningless by a single decisive moment that exposed the absurdity and danger of unchecked power. My daughter and I returned to our driveway, the quiet hum of suburban life surrounding us, but everything had changed. No longer could the HOA's petty rules dictate our sense of security or peace. Letters that once inspired anxiety now seemed laughable. Neighbors approached us cautiously at first, then with admiration, sharing stories of their own frustrations with the HOA and realizing that they were not alone in feeling bullied or micromanaged. What had started as a personal conflict became a subtle movement, a community-wide reckoning that drew attention to the overreach of authority. The officer, meanwhile, faced more than embarrassment. Reports were filed, documentation was collected, and the HOA board found itself in a position it had never encountered before: accountability. Every arbitrary rule, every intimidation tactic, every misuse of power had been meticulously exposed. The lessons were clear. Authority is conditional, respect is earned, and threats against others carry consequences far beyond what anyone expecting compliance could imagine. For my daughter, the incident was more than a confrontation. It was a reminder of her own strength, training, and capacity to protect not just herself, but her family and her community. For me, it highlighted the importance of standing firm, observing carefully, and never underestimating the absurdity of those who wield power without wisdom. Our home, once a quiet refuge, had become a symbol of resistance against trivial but escalating authority, a reminder that even in suburban calm, courage and composure can prevail. The neighborhood slowly settled back into its rhythm, but the impact lingered. Petty rules and fines were reconsidered, interactions with the HOA became more cautious, and a quiet respect grew among neighbors who had witnessed the unfolding events. The confrontation had rewritten the unwritten rules of the street. Intimidation would no longer be tolerated, and strength, even when silent and composed, demanded recognition. As we closed the chapter on this particular conflict, one truth remained unmistakable. Control, when exercised without fairness or understanding, invites consequences. And sometimes the smallest spark, an overlooked $79 fine, a moment of courage, a refusal to bow to absurd authority, can ignite a series of events that change not just a family's life, but the fabric of an entire community. So I ask you, as you consider your own interactions, your own confrontations, and the authority figures in your life, how would you respond when petty rules cross the line? Would you comply, ignore, or stand firm? Because in the end, it is not the power of the oppressor that defines the outcome. It is the courage, skill, and unwavering resolve of those who refuse to be intimidated.